The Chrysalids, Chapter 7. The arrival of my sister Petra came as a genuine surprise to me and a conventional surprise to everyone else. There had been a slight, but not quite attributable sense of expectation around the house for the previous week or two, but it remained unmentioned and unacknowledged. For me, the feeling that I was being kept unaware of something afoot was unresolved until there came the night when a baby howled. It was penetrating, unmistakable, and certainly within the house, where there had been no baby the day before. But in the morning, nobody referred to the sound in the night. No one, indeed, would dream of mentioning the matter openly until the inspector should have called to issue his certificate that it was a human baby in the true image. Should it unhappily turn out to violate the image and thus be ineligible for a certificate, everyone would continue to be unaware of it, and the whole regrettable incident would be deemed not to have ever occurred. And as soon as it was light, my father sent a farm employee off on a horse to summon the inspector. And, waiting his arrival, the whole household tried to disguise its anxiety by pretending we were just starting another ordinary day. This pretense grew thinner as time went on, for the stable hand, instead of bringing back the inspector right away, as was to be expected when a man of my father's position and importance was concerned, he simply returned with a polite message to say that the inspector would certainly do his best to find time to pay a visit sometime during the day. It was very unwise for even a righteous man to quarrel with his local inspector and to call him names in public. The inspector has too many ways of hitting back. My father became very angry, all the more so since the rules did not allow him to admit what he was angry about. Furthermore, he was well aware that the inspector intended him to be angry. He spent the morning hanging around the house and yard, exploding with his bad temper now and then over trivial matters, so that everyone crept around on tiptoe and worked very hard indeed in order to not attract his attention. One did not even dare to announce a birth until the child had been officially examined and approved, and the longer that the formal announcement was delayed, the more time malicious people had to invent reasons for the delay. A man of importance looked to having the certificate granted at the earliest possible moment. And with the word baby still unmentionable, we all had to go on pretending that my mother was in bed for some other reason, a slight cold perhaps. My sister Mary disappeared now and then towards my mother's room, and for the rest of the time tried to hide her anxiety by loudly bossing around the other household girls. I felt compelled to hang around in order not to miss the announcement when it should come, and my father kept on prowling. The suspense was aggravated by everyone's knowledge that on the last two similar occasions there had been no certificate forthcoming. My father must have been well aware of this too, and no doubt the inspector was aware of it too. But there was plenty of silent speculation whether my father would, as the law allowed, send my mother away if this occasion should turn out to be similarly unfortunate. Meanwhile, since it would have been both impolite and undignified to go running after the inspector, there was nothing to be done but to bear this suspense as best we could. It was not until mid-afternoon that the inspector ambled up on his pony. My father pulled himself together and went out to receive him. This effort to be even formally polite nearly strangled him. And even then, the inspector was not brisk. He dismounted in a leisurely fashion and strolled into the house, chatting about the weather. Father, red in the face, handed him over to Mary, who took the inspector along to Mother's room. But then followed the worst wait of all. Mary said afterwards that he hummed and hawed for an unconscionable length of time while he examined the baby in minutest detail. At last, however, he emerged, with an expressionless face, and in the little used sitting room he sat down at the table and fussed for a while about getting a good point on his pen. And at last he took a form from his pouch, and in a slow, deliberate hand wrote that he officially found the child to be a true female human being, free from any detectable form of deviation. He regarded that thoughtfully for some moments, as though not perfectly satisfied. He let his hand hesitate before he actually dated and signed the form, and then he sealed it carefully and handed it to my enraged father, still with a faint air of uncertainty. He had, of course, no real doubt in his mind, or he would have called for another opinion, and my father was perfectly well aware of that, too. At last, Petra's existence could be admitted. I was formally told that I had a new sister, and presently I was taken to see her, where she lay in a crib beside my mother's bed. She looked so pink and wrinkled to me that I did not see how the inspector could have been quite sure about her. However, there was nothing obviously wrong with her, so she had got her certificate. Nobody could blame the inspector for that. She did appear to be as normal as a newborn baby ever looked. And while we were taking turns to look at her, somebody started to ring the bell in the customary way, and everyone on the farm stopped working, and very soon we were all assembled in our kitchen for prayers of thanksgiving. 2, or it may have been 3 days after Petra was born, I happened upon a piece of my family's history that I would prefer to have never known. I was sitting quietly in the room next to my parents' bedroom, where my mother still lay in bed. It was a matter of chance and strategy, too. This was the latest place that I had discovered to stay hidden a while after the midday meal, until the coast was clear, and I could slip away without being given an afternoon job. So far, nobody had thought of looking there for me. It was simply a matter of putting in half an hour or so. Normally, this room was very convenient, although at the present its use required caution, because the plaster wall between the rooms was cracked, and I had to move very cautiously on tiptoe, unless my mother would hear me. On that particular day, I was just thinking that I had allowed nearly enough time for people to be busy again, when a 2-wheeled cart drove up, and as it passed the window, I caught a glimpse of Aunt Harriet holding the reins. I had only seen my aunt some 8 or 9 times in my life, for she lived 15 miles away in the direction of Kentuck. But what I knew of her I liked. She was 3 years younger than my mother, and on the surface they were not dissimilar, and yet in Aunt Harriet each feature was softer than my mother, so that the effect of them altogether made a different person. I used to think that when I looked at Aunt Harriet, I was actually seeing my mother, as she might have been, as I thought I would have liked her to be. Aunt Harriet was easier to talk to as well, and she did not have the manner of listening to me only to correct me. I edged over carefully on my stockinged feet to the window, and I watched her tether her horse and lift a white bundle out of the trap cart and carry it into the house. She could not have met anyone, for a few seconds later her steps passed the door, and the latch of the next room clicked. "Why, Harriet!" my mother's voice exclaimed in surprise, and not altogether in approval. "So soon? You don't mean to say you brought that tiny baby all this way?" "I know," said Aunt Harriet's voice, accepting the blame in my mother's tone. "But I had to, Emily. I had to. I heard your baby had come early, so Oh, there she is. Oh, she's lovely, Emily. She's a lovely baby." And there was a pause. Presently she added, "Mine's lovely too, isn't she? Isn't she a lovely darling?" There was a certain amount of mutual congratulations, which did not interest me in the slightest. I didn't really think the babies could have looked much different than any other babies, really. And then my mother said, "I am glad, my dear. Henry must be delighted." "Of course he is," said Aunt Harriet. But there was something wrong about the way she said it. Even I could hear that. But she hurried on. "She was born a week ago, and I didn't know what to do. And then when I heard that your baby had come early and was a girl too, why, it was like God answering my prayer." She paused and then added, with a casualness that somehow failed to be casual, "And you've got the certificate for her?" Of course. My mother's tone was sharp and ready for attack. I knew the expression on her face which would go with that tone. And when she spoke again, there was a disturbing quality to her voice. "Harriet," she demanded sharply, "are you trying to tell me that you have not got a certificate?" But my aunt made no reply, and I thought I caught the sound of a suppressed sob. My mother said coldly and forcibly, "Harriet, let me see that child properly." And for a few seconds I could hear nothing but more sobbing from my aunt. And then my aunt said unsteadily, "It's such a little thing, you see. It's nothing much." "Nothing much," snapped my mother. "You have the effrontery to bring this monster into my house and tell me it's nothing much? Monster!" Aunt Harriet's voice sounded as though she had been slapped. "Oh! Oh!" And she broke down into moanings. And after a time, my mother said, "No wonder you didn't dare to call the inspector." And Aunt Harriet went on crying. My mother let the sobs almost die away before she said, "I'd like to know why you've come here, Harriet. Why did you bring that here?" Aunt Harriet blew her nose, and when she spoke, it was in a dull, flat voice. "When she came, when I saw her, I wanted to kill myself. I knew they would never approve her, although it's such a tiny thing. But I didn't, because I thought perhaps I could save her somehow. I love her. She's a lovely baby, except for that. She is, isn't she?" My mother said nothing, and Aunt Harriet went on. "I don't know how, but I hoped. I knew I could keep her for a little while before they'd take her away. Just the month that they give you before you have to notify. I decided I must have her for at least that long." "And Henry? What does he say about it?" He said we ought to notify at once, but I wouldn't let him. I couldn't, Emily. I couldn't. Dear God. Not a third time. So I kept her. I prayed and hoped. And then, when I heard that your baby had come early, I thought perhaps God had answered my prayers." "Indeed, Harriet," said my mother coldly, "I doubt whether that had anything to do with it. Nor," she added pointedly, "do I see what you mean." "I thought," Aunt Harriet went on, spiritlessly now, but forcing herself to the words, "I thought that if I could leave my baby with you and borrow yours—" My mother gave an incredulous gasp. Apparently words eluded her. "It would only be for a day or two, just so I could get the certificate," Aunt Harriet went on. You are my sister, Emily, my sister, and the only person in this world who could help me to keep my baby." She began to cry again. There was another long pause, and then my mother's voice. "In all my life, I have never heard anything so outrageous. To come here suggesting that I should enter into an immoral, a criminal conspiracy I think you must be mad, Harriet, to think that I would lend you—" But she broke off at the sound of my father's heavy steps in the hallway.